Black boy saves old woman from fire. 24 hours later, she brings lawyers to her house. But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. Detroit streets were still and quiet as the evening cast a soft glow over the neighborhood. Marcus Carter, a 15-year-old boy with sharp eyes and an even sharper determination, was on his way home after basketball practice. Clad in his worn sneakers and a hoodie, he hummed a tune, his backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. His house, a small but well-kept brick structure, was just a few blocks away. As he approached the intersection near Mrs. Clara Anderson's home, Marcus noticed something unusual. Smoke, thick and ominous, was billowing out of the windows of the old two-story house. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that Mrs. Clara, a widow in her 70s, lived alone. Without hesitating, Marcus dropped his backpack and sprinted toward the house. "Mrs. Clara, Mrs. Clara!" he shouted, pounding on the front door. There was no answer. Panic surged through him as flames began licking the edges of the wooden frame. Marcus turned the doorknob. It was unlocked, and pushed his way in, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. The living room was already engulfed in chaos, furniture crackling under the advancing fire. "Help!" A faint, terrified voice called from upstairs. Marcus darted toward the staircase, navigating through the oppressive heat. His legs trembled, but he pressed on, driven by a singular thought. He couldn't let her die. On the second floor, he found her huddled in a corner of her bedroom. Mrs. Clara was pale, her frail frame trembling as she clutched a photo album to her chest. "Marcus?" she whispered, her eyes widening in disbelief. "It's okay. I've got you," he said firmly, wrapping his arms around her. He guided her toward the stairs as the flames roared louder, threatening to consume everything in their path. As they reached the front door, Marcus spotted two neighbors standing frozen in their yards. "Call 911!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. Seconds later, they stumbled out into the open air, coughing violently. Marcus eased Mrs. Clara onto the grass as she clung to his arm. You saved me," she gasped, tears streaming down her sooty cheeks. Before Marcus could respond, the wail of sirens filled the air, signaling the arrival of firefighters and paramedics. As the medics checked Mrs. Clara's vitals, Marcus stood silently, his adrenaline fading. He watched the firefighters battle the blaze, realizing that he had just risked his life for someone he barely knew. That night, as Marcus sat at the kitchen table recounting the events to his mother, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did a brave thing today," she said softly. But the worry in her eyes told another story. In their tight-knit but struggling community, heroism didn't always lead to happy endings. Unbeknownst to Marcus, the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The following morning, the Carter household was abuzz with chatter, both local and online. News of Marcus's daring rescue spread quickly, reaching corners of the neighborhood Marcus never expected. Neighbors stopped by the house to check on him, some with warm smiles, others with skeptical glances. "Marcus, you're a hero!" Mrs. Evelyn, the woman from the corner store, exclaimed as she handed him a bag of fresh bagels. Not everyone would have risked their life like that. Marcus mumbled a polite thank you, embarrassed by the attention. He wasn't sure how to feel about the word hero. What he had done felt instinctive, not extraordinary. But not everyone shared Mrs. Evelyn's enthusiasm. "That boy could have gotten himself killed," Mr. Johnson muttered to another neighbor across the street. "Doesn't he know better than to run into a burning house?" Marcus overheard the conversation as he stood on the porch. His mother, Deirdre Carter, sensed his discomfort and ushered him back inside. "People will talk, Marcus," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Don't let it get to you. You did what you thought was right." As the day wore on, Marcus found himself thinking about Mrs. Clara. The firefighters had told him she was taken to the hospital for observation. Was she okay? What would happen to her now? The fire had gutted most of her home, leaving it uninhabitable. "Maybe we should visit her," Marcus suggested at dinner, pushing his food around his plate. His mother hesitated. "That's kind of you, but let's give her some time to recover," she replied. Deirdre's mind was elsewhere, occupied by their own troubles. The Carters were no strangers to financial struggles. Deirdre worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and Marcus contributed by doing odd jobs after school. The prospect of an unplanned expense, like replacing Marcus's smoke-damaged clothes, loomed heavily. By evening, Marcus's phone buzzed incessantly with texts and social media notifications. His classmates had heard about the fire, and some had even recorded videos of the aftermath. "You're trending, bro," one text read. Despite the newfound attention, Marcus felt uneasy. It wasn't fame he sought. It was reassurance that Mrs. Clara was safe. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of her terrified face from his mind. "Did I really do enough?" he whispered into the darkness. The thought gnawed at him, keeping sleep at bay. Meanwhile, in a quiet hospital room across town, Mrs. Clara sat propped against crisp white pillows. Her fingers traced the edges of a photo Marcus had saved from the fire, her late husband's portrait. "That boy," she murmured, her voice tinged with both gratitude and resolve. Unbeknownst to Marcus, Mrs. Clara had plans to show her gratitude in a way that would change both of their lives forever. The sun had barely risen over Detroit when the roar of an expensive engine echoed down the street. Marcus, still groggy from a restless night, peeked through the window to see a sleek black car pulling into their driveway. Its shiny surface stood in stark contrast to the modest surroundings of their neighborhood. Who could that be? Deirdre wondered aloud, tying her bathrobe as she moved toward the door. The doorbell rang, sharp and purposeful. Marcus joined his mother as she opened the door, revealing Mrs. Clara, flanked by 2 well-dressed individuals carrying briefcases. Despite the oxygen mask hanging loosely around her neck, Mrs. Clara stood tall, her eyes filled with purpose. "Good morning, Deirdre. Marcus," she said, her voice warm but firm. "May we come in?" Deirdre hesitated, her eyes darting toward the strangers. "Of course," she said finally, stepping aside to let them in. The Carters' living room, small but inviting, was quickly filled with an air of tension as everyone took their seats. Marcus, seated on the worn couch, fidgeted under the weight of Mrs. Clara's gaze. He half expected her to scold him for entering her house uninvited. "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble," Marcus blurted out. I didn't know what else to do." Mrs. Clara's expression softened, and she reached for his hand. "Marcus, what you did wasn't trouble. It was bravery," she said. "You risked your life to save mine, and I owe you a debt I can never fully repay." Marcus blinked, stunned into silence. Deirdre sat straighter, her protective instincts kicking in. "Mrs. Clara, you don't owe us anything," she said cautiously. "We're just glad you're okay." But Mrs. Clara wasn't finished. She gestured toward the 2 lawyers. "This is Mr. Langley and Ms. Porter. They're here to help me put something in motion." One of the lawyers, a tall man with a calm demeanor, opened his briefcase and handed a folder to Mrs. Clara, who slid it across the table toward Deirdre and Marcus. "I want to create a scholarship fund in Marcus's name," Mrs. Clara said. "It will pay for his education and help other young people in this community pursue their dreams." For a moment, the room was silent. Marcus stared at the folder, his mind racing. "A scholarship? For me?" he stammered. Deirdre's voice was measured but tinged with disbelief. "Mrs. Clara, this is too generous." "No, Deirdre, it's the least I can do," Mrs. Clara insisted. "This neighborhood has potential, but it's starved of opportunity. Marcus reminded me of the strength and kindness still alive here. This fund isn't just for him, it's for everyone like him." Marcus felt a lump rising in his throat. His life had been a steady stream of challenges, each one chipping away at his belief in a brighter future. Now, sitting in his living room, he saw a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. "But why would you do all this for me?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Clara smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Because, Marcus, someone once did the same for me. It's my turn to pass it on." Deirdre placed a hand over her chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Mrs. Clara replied. "Your son did." As the lawyers discussed the next steps, Marcus sat in stunned silence, grappling with the enormity of what was happening. The boy who had run into a fire without thinking was now being handed the keys to a better future, not just for himself, but for his entire community. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Marcus and his family. True to her word, Mrs. Clara moved quickly, enlisting the help of her legal team to establish the Marcus Carter Community Scholarship Fund. Local news outlets picked up the story, labeling Marcus a hero and highlighting Mrs. Clara's philanthropy. The attention brought waves of both admiration and skepticism to their quiet neighborhood. One sunny afternoon, Marcus found himself at the Scholarship Fund's inaugural meeting. Held in a community center that had seen better days, the event was packed with local leaders, teachers, and families. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair at the front of the room, feeling out of place amidst the applause and camera flashes. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, gripping the edges of the podium as he faced the crowd. I don't really know what to say," he began, his voice shaky. "I didn't save Mrs. Clara for attention or anything like this. I just knew she needed help and I couldn't stand by and do nothing." The audience erupted into cheers, but Marcus quickly waved them down. "But this isn't just about me," he continued, his voice growing steadier. "This fund isn't just about one person. It's about all of us helping each other. It's about making sure no kid in this neighborhood has to give up on their dreams." From the front row, Mrs. Clara beamed with pride. She had seen something remarkable in Marcus from the moment he saved her, a resilience and a drive that reminded her of her younger self. After the meeting, Marcus found her by the refreshments table, nibbling on a sugar cookie. "You were amazing up there," she said warmly. "I just said what I felt," Marcus replied, scratching the back of his head. "This still feels unreal, you know?" Mrs. Clara chuckled. "Believe me, I know the feeling. When I first inherited my late husband's estate, I didn't know what to do with it. For years, I let it sit untouched, thinking money couldn't fix what was broken. But now, seeing how it can build something good, it's given me a new purpose." As the days turned into weeks, Marcus's life began to change in ways he hadn't imagined. With the scholarship fund underway, he started to see opportunities that had once felt out of reach. His teachers at school encouraged him to think about college, and his classmates began treating him with newfound respect. But not everything was smooth sailing. Some neighbors whispered about the changes, their voices laced with jealousy. "Why him?" one woman grumbled to a friend at the market. "Plenty of kids in this neighborhood are struggling too." Marcus overheard the comment while shopping with his mom. It stung, but he shrugged it off. "You can't make everyone happy," Deirdre said, patting his shoulder. "I just hope they see that this isn't about me," Marcus replied. "It's about giving everyone a chance." Meanwhile, Mrs. Clara continued her mission with an unwavering resolve. She met with community leaders and business owners, rallying support for programs aimed at improving the neighborhood. Marcus often joined her, sitting quietly in meetings, absorbing every word. One evening, as they walked home from a town hall, Marcus turned to her with a question that had been gnawing at him. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you really were before the fire?" Mrs. Clara smiled wistfully. "Sometimes people see wealth and forget to see the person behind it, she explained. I wanted to know if this neighborhood still had heart, if kindness and courage still mattered, and you, Marcus, reminded me that it does. Her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he lay in bed that night. The journey that had begun with a fire now burned brighter, fueled by the promise of change and the power of compassion. Marcus knew this was just the beginning, and he was determined to make every moment count. Months later, the neighborhood buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. The once dilapidated community center was now under renovation, thanks to the Scholarship Fund's success. Colorful murals depicting hope and unity adorned its outer walls, painted by local artists inspired by Marcus's story. A banner hung proudly across the entrance. Carter Scholarship, building futures, one dream at a time. Marcus, now 16, stood on the newly paved steps, watching as a group of kids played basketball on the freshly painted court. A smile crept across his face as he remembered how he used to play there, oblivious to the possibilities that now seemed endless. Behind him, Mrs. Clara approached, her cane tapping lightly against the ground. Though her movements were slower, her spirit was as vibrant as ever. "Looks like they're having fun," she remarked, nodding toward the kids. "They are," Marcus replied, turning to her. "None of this would have happened without you." Mrs. Clara chuckled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Without me? Marcus, it was your courage that started all this. I just had the means to make it bigger." The Scholarship Fund had already helped several local students secure spots in college, including Marcus's best friend, Isaiah, who was the first in his family to attend university. The ripple effect was undeniable. Families were finding hope, and the community was slowly transforming into a beacon of resilience. But the changes weren't confined to the neighborhood. The fund's story gained traction in national media, drawing donations from philanthropists across the country. Soon, the Carter Scholarship expanded its reach, providing resources for education, mentorship programs, and even workshops for parents to support their children's learning. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus was called to speak at a major event celebrating the scholarship's achievements. The venue was packed with donors, recipients, and community members. As he stepped up to the podium, the audience fell silent, waiting to hear from the boy who had inspired it all. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began, gripping the edges of the podium. "I used to think my life was just about getting by. I never imagined that something as small as helping a neighbor could lead to something this big." He paused, scanning the room. "But this isn't about me. It's about us. It's about what we can do when we look out for one another. Mrs. Clara taught me that. She believed in me when I didn't even know how to believe in myself. And now, I want to pass that belief on to as many people as I can." The audience erupted in applause, and Mrs. Clara wiped a tear from her eye. As Marcus stepped down, she pulled him into a warm embrace. "You've become everything I hoped for and more," she whispered. Later that evening, Marcus sat with his mother on their porch, the two of them watching the stars. Deirdre, who had been skeptical of the attention at first, now felt nothing but pride. "You've done something incredible, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not just me," Marcus replied, leaning back. "It's you, Mrs. Clara, the whole neighborhood. We're all in this together." Deirdre smiled, her heart full as she placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "You're going to do great things, Marcus. I can feel it." The story of Marcus and Mrs. Clara became a legend in Detroit, a testament to the power of compassion and community. Their partnership continued to thrive, with Marcus taking on more leadership roles as he grew older. Years later, when Mrs. Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep, Marcus was at her side. She left behind a legacy not just of wealth, but of hope, ensuring that her vision of a kinder, stronger world lived on. The Carter Scholarship grew into a nationwide initiative, but Marcus never forgot its humble beginnings. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, he visited the rebuilt home where it all began. Standing on the lawn, he would take a moment to reflect on how far he and his community had come. Sometimes it just takes one act of kindness, he'd say, his voice steady with conviction, to light a fire that changes everything.